In this demonstration, we're going to take the basic measures that we created in the last video, and we're just going to start making these measures slightly more complicated by adding some filter criteria to these measures. So we're only going to talk about 5 filter functions. I feel like these are 5 filter functions that are going to cover a lot of your bases, especially when you're starting out with DAX. And so we're going to talk about calculate, filter, all and all selected, which are, obviously they sound similar, and that's because they perform sort of a similar function with some nuance that's really important to understand. And then finally, selected value. So the first thing that we're going to do before we start demonstrating how these 5 filter functions work is we're going to create a new table. So I'm going to go up here to enter data, and we're going to create a new measure table to store these filter function measures. And so I'm just going to call this table O2 filter measures. And I'm going to load the table, and I'm going to wait for it to appear right here. There it is. And now I'm going to create a new measure. And this measure is going to be sort of take our revenue measure over here, and we're just going to extend it to include some filter criteria. So for now, just so I can save this measure without throwing an error, I'm just going to call this revenue filter, and I'm just going to go ahead and save it. And you can see there it is. It doesn't have anything in it, but it at least lets me save the measure as like a placeholder while I right-click on column 1 and hide it to transform my O2 filter measures table into a measure table. So, if you're curious what happens when I add this to the page, there's my measure revenue filter, and if I transform this into a card visual, it just says blank, basically letting me know that this measure is completely empty. And if you're like me, I don't usually just leave a measure empty. So if you even want to type in something like a function called blank, which just looks like this, blank with parentheses, you can also just write that, and it'll give you exactly the same result. It'll still throw blank, which makes sense, right? But it just kind of keeps that measure empty until you add something more interesting. So what we're going to do now is we are going to call calculate, which is kind of like the mother of all DAX functions. Calculate is really your key function to sort of nesting multiple functions together and writing very specific, more complex sort of DAX measures. So I use calculate a ton. The more comfortable you get with DAX and the more complicated DAX scenarios you try to conquer, the more you're probably going to end up using calculate. I'm just kind of letting you know, hey, calculate is going to become your bread and butter DAX function. It is sort of, I would say the single DAX function that probably carries the most weight. So we're going to start with calculate by going up here, and I'm just going to do this one more time. I'm going to sort of write a parenthesis, and you can see that calculate is a measure that evaluates an expression in a context modified by filters. An expression just means some sort of aggregation, some revenue, average revenue, or if we want to, we can just call a measure that we've already written, which is what we're going to do. Beyond that, calculate starts to look for things like other filter functions that are going to help us do unique things with that measure or expression or aggregation. So within calculate, I'm just going to start typing in revenue, and I'm going to grab the revenue measure that I already wrote up here, and I'm just going to wrap that in calculate. You might be thinking, okay, well, Sean, what did that do? And the honest, for beginners impression is it didn't do much. If you want, I'll go ahead and just throw 2 new cards onto the page so that we can sort of compare these side by side. So let's go ahead and make these 2 cards about the same size. I'm going to throw revenue into one, and I'm going to throw my revenue filter measure into the other. And you can see there is calculate, revenue, and one thing that is coming out of this is you will notice that this new calculate revenue measure doesn't have the right formatting. It's not showing me 2 decimal places. So, if we want to, we could go ahead and format this measure, but you'll notice that the outputs are basically the same. So I'm just going to click on this real quickly. I'm going to go up to my formatting options, click on currency so that this becomes now a currency measure. And next we're going to go up here. We're going to turn this into a bar chart. We're going to add product category to the y-axis. And we're going to do the same with our revenue filter measure. Just going to turn this into a bar chart and add product category so that you can see both of these look almost exactly the same. They're basically coming up with the same output. What we're going to do now, though, is we're going to apply the filter function within the context of this bar chart. So I'm going to go up here to revenue filter, and I'm going to get rid of the closing parenthesis, and I'm going to add a new function within my calculate statement. Just going to hit a comma first, and you can see when I type in that comma, I'm now, Power BI and DAX are now waiting for me to add some sort of filter criteria here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a filter function, and I'm going to call this product category field that I'm using over here. And so I'm going to grab my products table, which is the first step of our filter function. First, we have to identify which table our filter is coming from. And within our products table, I'm going to grab my product category field, and I'm going to specify that I only want this measure to contain revenue for toys. And in fact, I'm going to go ahead and rename this measure to revenue filter toys. And I'm getting an error because I forgot to throw a closing quotation mark there, but that's fine. I just need to go back here and get rid of the parentheses. And now we're good. I have a calculate revenue measure, and it's filtered just for where product category equals toys. And you'll notice over here that my bar chart updated to eliminate all of the product categories that are not toys. And notice if I wanted just those four and I wanted to exclude toys, I can switch this very easily by throwing my, reverse arrows or my not equal to. And when I save that, I get everything except for toys. You'll notice that toys is now missing here. But let's go ahead and change this back so that I'm just pulling revenue for toys. And real quickly, I'm just going to go ahead and add cards back onto this page. And I'm going to add revenue to the first card, and I'm going to add revenue filtered for toys to the other card. So you can see I've got my 5.093 revenue included in this revenue, but it's the only value that's coming up here in this card because this measure has been filtered just for the toys product category. Now, if I wanted to write a new measure or something, I can, I can write a new measure to calculate, what percentage of total revenue toys makes up. So let's go ahead and write a new measure. I'm going to call this percent of revenue toys. And I'm going to just divide my toy filtered revenue by my total revenue measure. And I'm going to go ahead and just click this and add it over here. And you can see I've got 0.35, which just needs to be reformatted. It's currently a decimal or floating decimal type. And let's go ahead and change this into a percentage. And you can see it gets reformatted. And maybe I only want to show one decimal place. So there's my 35.3%, which is the amount of revenue that toys makes up out of all of my product revenue. Now, let's talk about how to calculate something very similar, but for all of our product categories. In other words, what if I want to compare this 35.3% to the other product categories? What percentage of total revenue do they make up? So I'm going to go ahead and give myself some space here, And first, let's just talk about the problem that or the question that we're trying to answer here. I'm going to add a table here, and I'm going to add my revenue, and I'm going to add product category. And what I'm trying to get at is what percentage of revenue each of these product categories makes up. And there's both an easy way to do this and a DAX way, as is the case with a lot of fairly basic things in Power BI. So first, just so we can kind of read this, since this is a class that I'm teaching, and my vision's terrible, maybe your vision's terrible, let's go ahead and increase these fonts so that they're easier to read. And I'm going to go over to where my columns are here in this table, and I'm going to click on this little caret here, and I'm going to select Show Value as % of grand total. That's the easy way to do it. And there's my 35.3% for toys. But what if we want to calculate this using DAX? There are a couple of different ways that we can do it, but the way that we're going to talk about relies on ALL and ALLSELECTED. So let's go ahead and head over here, and we're going to create revenue, a measure called revenue all product category. And this is going to be calculate revenue. And I'm just going to go ahead and add this first to the table. Just calculate revenue. You've already seen what this does, but I want you to see the difference that is made when we utilize all. So I'm going to click back into my measure, and now I'm going to add a new filter function, which is all, and I'm going to call my product category field. And so what this is going to do is it's going to calculate revenue for all product categories. It's going to combine them all. And now notice that I've got that 14.44 million revenue all the way down for all of these values. That's exactly what I want in this case, because what this allows me to do by having my revenue summed up for all product categories at this level, I can now add revenue into the table, the revenue measure that I already created, and I can now divide these together to get the same values that are already being automatically generated over here. So I'm going to create a new measure here, and this is going to be % of revenue, all products, or all product categories specifically. And I'm going to divide, of course, and I'm going to divide revenue by my revenue all product category. In other words, I'm dividing this value by this value. Now I'm going to go ahead and add this into the table, and you can see I might have made this too large. There's my 0.19, 0.16. These values match perfectly with what's over here. I just need to go in very quickly and format this measure just like I did previously. So let's go ahead and format this as decimals, or as percentages rather. And you can see the values correspond exactly over here. And let's go ahead and make this 1 decimal place. And now let's talk about the difference between all and ALLSELECTED. Because if you'll remember, I used all, right? So let's go ahead and turn this first bar chart up here. Let's get rid of revenue and let's turn it into a slicer. And specifically, let's go over to our slicer settings and let's enable multi-select and let's enable select all. Notice that when I click on any of these decimal values here are going to persist. In other words, they're not going to change. So let's click on electronics. There's my 15.6%. If I click on games, I'll get 15.4%. And if I click on sports and outdoors, I'll just get 15%. Notice what happens when I change this from an all function to an ALLSELECTED function. So I'm going to change the name of the measure first to ALLSELECTED, and I'm going to change this to ALLSELECTED as well. And first, it's going to look like nothing happened, right? However, when we were using all, we were basically telling Power BI to always return the percent of revenue for all values in the product category field, regardless of any filters that are being applied outside. When we're using all selected, we're going to get the same result, but we're going to enable Power BI to apply some high-level filtering. So notice when I click on one of these values in this slicer, I'm not going to get the values that are saved here necessarily. So electronics, the percentage is 15.6%. Notice when I click on electronics now, I get 100%. And that is because there is now a filter hitting this measure from product category. So now I'm only calculating the percent of revenue for all of the product categories that I have selected. And in this case, I only have one product category selected, electronics, which is why I'm getting 100% for this measure. That will change when I start adding additional filters here. So here you can see revenue for electronics and games is really, really similar, basically within about $20,000 of each other. So now I'm not getting the percentage of all revenue. I'm getting the percentage of the selected amount of revenue, which is just electronics and games, about $4.5 million. And you can see that my percentage here is about 50-50, 50.2% and 49.8%. As I add more product categories, those percentages are going to continue to update based on what I have selected. That's why it's all selected. I'm not getting the percent of revenue for all product categories. I'm only getting the percent of revenue for the specific product categories that I chose to select. And of course, if I unselect everything, then I'm back to basically where I started. But just letting you know that, all selected is a bit more flexible for calculating these percentages. If you, like for example, your user is going to be applying a whole bunch of slicer or filter criteria and then wants to see, what percentage a given measure makes up for their filter or filtered or sliced criteria. Whereas if you use all, it basically ignores all filters related to whatever you put in that all function. And finally, just to kind of wrap this up, I wanted to talk about one more measure that can be pretty cool, and that is selected value. And what selected value does, and I'm just going to delete this table to give myself some room, selected value is going to return whatever we have selected from a slicer, in this case, product category. So let's go ahead and add a new measure here, and we're going to call this selected product category. And this measure is pretty easy to write. It's just selected value, and it's looking for, if you'll look up here in the hint that appears, it's looking for a column name. So I'm going to go ahead and select product category. And now I'm just going to add my measure over here in a card. And of course you're seeing that it's blank. And it's supposed to be blank right now because we haven't actually selected a product category yet. So you'll notice selected value product category. Here I have a slicer for product category that lets me select one. And so I'm just going to select arts and crafts, and you'll notice I have arts and crafts. As soon as I multi-select, I've got blank because now I have multiple items selected instead of just one. But I've got electronics, games, sports and outdoors, and toys. So I basically have a function that is going to update with whatever I have selected from this slicer up here. And that means that we can also use this value, arts and crafts, for example, as an input to another measure if we need that. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to write a new measure, and I'm just going to call it revenue filtered by selected product category. And let's go ahead and call our revenue within a calculate statement. And let's go ahead and add a filter here. And we're going to filter, of course, by our products table. And we're going to filter our product category specifically. And we're going to filter that based on the product category equaling our selected product category measure. In other words, we're going to filter revenue based on product category equaling whatever happens to be in this measure. So what do you think is going to happen when we have nothing selected? So right now, we haven't selected a slicer up here, and you can see that selected product category equals blank, which means that product category in this filter statement of this measure also technically equals blank right now. So let's go ahead and just add this, and let's go ahead and grab our measure, and we're just going to add it over here. And you can see right now, we're looking at everything, which is totally fine. Basically, there is no filter being applied because we haven't actually selected anything from product category. So let's see what happens when we select arts and crafts. You can see revenue for arts and crafts up here using our original revenue measure. You can see here that selected product category equals arts and crafts, which is what we've selected. And here we've got revenue once again, but filtered by arts and crafts. So this is just demonstrating another way of applying sort of dynamic filtering. And this is also going to allow us to apply some really unique, conditional formatting and creating our own text logic later on. So if the value of selected value isn't quite, clicking for you just yet, no problem. We're going to talk about it more in some of the demonstrations that are coming up. I just wanted to kind of give you some exposure to it as a filter function because we're going to be revisiting it.